Evolutionary theory and psychology, precursors to Darwinian theory, Jean Lamark. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, President. Jean Lamarck was a Frenchman who developed a theory of evolution prior to Darwin's. Now, he missed the mark in several cases, but he also got some things right. So let's take a look briefly at Lamarck's theory. His first premise is that environmental pressures lead to structural changes in plants and animals. That's pretty good. I don't think any modern evolutionist would doubt that one. That's pretty safe. He developed something, though, that went off track with that. And it's called the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, with the emphasis on acquired characteristic. Lamarck makes two arguments for his form of evolution. First of all, the notion of simplicity versus complexity. And he believed that there was an inherent tendency in living creatures to progress from simple forms to more complex. Now that can be, but is not necessarily true. At this point, he just got plain wrong. Lamarck believes simple forms of life originate by spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is something that you don't hear that much about these days because it's totally specious. Basically, the notion of spontaneous generation is that life arises from nothing. It was speculated on by some 19th century theorists who noticed that if you left a piece of meat out for it to rot, eventually you had parasitic life forms and eventually things like maggots and things like that in it. Very pleasant thing to talk about, right? Despite some rather controlled studies of this, it took a while for researchers to figure out that this is simply not the case. Life has to come from something else. They were missing microscopic things like the size of a fly's egg. But spontaneous generation never happened, never will. You don't get nothing out of nothing. Now, Lamarck has four elements to his evolutionary process. And the first, we don't have any arguments with. Animals face environmental pressures. All living organisms face environmental pressure. Second point, and this is where Lamarck starts noticing change. When environments change, animals have new needs. That's also very true. However, Lamarck then goes off the mark. Very bad pun. Sorry about that. Lamarck says that when environments change, animals have new needs. This is the second part of his. When environments change, animals have new needs, according to Lamarck and his notions of environmental change. He believes they respond to these needs by increasing the use of certain organs or capacities. Furthermore, those that are neglect organs or capacities that are no longer needed will eventually atrophy and go away. So some of these grains of wisdom are right. The animal may have new needs and may respond in some adaptive way by using some organ or capacity. Point 3, when an animal increases the use of an organ or capacity, it enlarges or strengthens that organ. And as I've already said previously, disuse of those organs or capacities atrophy them. They shrivel up, they go away. And furthermore, all of these changes are heritable. That's where Lamarck's making some relatively good points. But let's look at his process. Here's one of the most common notions used with Lamarck, that there was a horse-like creature that eventually evolved to be a giraffe. Originally it had a short neck, but because it kept on reaching up into the trees, it exercised and stretched its neck, and that increased neck length was what was heritable and passed down to a new generation. Well, this is just plain wrong, isn't it? If you exercise or change one of your characteristics, it doesn't mean that your children are going to inherit those characteristics. So if you exercise really hard, you get your six-pack and all that type of thing, it does not necessarily mean your child, when they exercise, are also going to have a six-pack. Now, they may have the capacity to have a six-pack, but just because you have earned one through exercise doesn't mean that your kids are going to inherit your six-pack or any of your other characteristics that you just might have used a lot. One of the limitations to Lamarck's notions was that he didn't believe that necessarily all animals came from a common ancestry, as Darwin later was to point out. A misreading of Lamarck is that the animals have the power themselves or the capacities to enlarge organs, in capacity to what they want. So the giraffe has the ability to stretch its neck, which will be, in turn, in subsequent generations, longer. So with Lamarck, you almost have this willingness, this desire to evolve and move in a certain way. Basically, if you acquire a characteristic through exercise or maybe even plastic surgery, it doesn't mean that characteristic is going to be passed down to individuals in the next generation. So Lamarck's out there floating his ideas before Darwin's around to do so. In some quarters, people pick them up and adhere to them for a very long time. For example, the Soviet-era program in genetics was hobbled because the mandate of science at that time in the Soviet Union was to accept Lamarckian evolution. So an organism can't change just because it wants to, and it can't make its offspring change in a certain way just because it wants to. But Lamarck is getting some things right. He's talking about how characteristics are heritable. He's talking about how environmental pressures come to bear. But he doesn't do it in terms of selection. He does it in terms of animals acquiring characteristics based on the environment, which they simply don't do. So we will move on in our next lecture and talk about some other precursors to Darwinian theory. See you next time. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.